So I'm Ellen Jennings. I am pastor of Cleveland Park Congregational UCC, and we are delighted, as I said a minute ago, about how many of you are interested in this subject. Housing justice has become much more of an issue that is on our radar over the past year or two. And we have been very interested in the intersection between racial justice issues and affordable housing and the history of both. So we're very, very excited about this evening's program and are so glad that you have all joined us. You are very welcome. And I'm going to hand it over to Emily Parker, who was our adult programs chairperson and was the prime mover of getting all of our speakers this evening. So thank you, Emily. And I know you're going to introduce our first couple of speakers before the panel.
Emily,
Unmute.
Thank you. Hi, I will keep this brief, but I just wanted to give a really brief overview of the program tonight. And I will not do justice to any of the speakers or capture even the tip of the iceberg in terms of their knowledge and experience, but I don't want you to hear from me. I want you to hear from them, and we have a lot planned. So we're going to start with a very short documentary called Segregated by Design, and that's going to place some of the issues we're going to be talking about regarding Ward 3 in a national context. Then Matthew Fruman, who is involved with WIN's Ward 3 Congregation's Affordable Housing Working Group and has so much knowledge, not only on the history of Ward 3, but current issues. He's going to give us some of the history of Ward 3 housing and segregation issues. And then we're also going to hear from Neil Flanagan, who is an architect and has written extensively on Ward 3 housing issues. And he's currently working on a book focusing on the transformation of DC in the early 20th century, connecting the monumental core to the development of its early suburbs and the clearance of African-American communities and the founders of American urban planning. So we're really lucky to have not one, but two experts on this. And then we want to turn to what can we do? How can we get more involved? And so we are very lucky to have Margaret Dwyer, who is the executive director of Ward 3 Housing Justice, and Barbara Kraft, who is the co-chair of the WIN's Ward 3 Working Group. And for those of you who don't know, WIN stands for Washington Interfaith Network. And so with that, let's start the film. Oh, sorry, one more thing. I completely forgot. We've set aside time at the end, once all the panelists have spoken, at the end for Q&A. So we'll wait to answer any questions then.
In the middle of the 20th century, the city of St. Louis, Missouri, and the United States federal government condemned and demolished the neighborhoods in downtown St. Louis where African Americans lived, displacing thousands. They built the Gateway Arch. They built a university, interstate highways, hospitals, and middle-class housing that was unaffordable to the former African American residents. Those who were displaced then relocated to the few other places available, converting inner-ring suburbs like Ferguson into new segregated enclaves. We have been led to believe that racial segregation in housing was de facto segregation, by accident or the result of private prejudices. Yes, private prejudice clearly contributed to segregation, but by itself it could not have segregated the country without the intention of the federal government to segregate neighborhoods throughout the nation. If, however, we understand the accurate history, the history that was once well known but we've all now forgotten, that racially segregated patterns in every metropolitan area like St. Louis were created by de jure segregation, racially explicit policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments designed to segregate metropolitan areas, then we can understand that we have an unconstitutional residential landscape. And if it's unconstitutional, then we have an obligation to remedy it. The federal government in the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s pursued policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. One important policy was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. In the late 1930s, another New Deal program, the United States Housing Authority, was adopted. The very first projects built under the United States Housing Authority authorization were in Austin, Texas, because the most aggressive proponent of public housing at that time was the congressman from Austin, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson got the United States Housing Authority to put its first projects in Austin, separate projects for whites, for African Americans, and the project for Hispanics. The project for African Americans was placed in a location that the city plan of Austin had designated as a ghetto for African Americans. The United States Housing Authority and the local Austin Housing Authority demolished something called Emancipation Park, which was a celebrations location for the abolition of slavery. The design was to move all African Americans in the city of Austin into this community, whether in public housing or in private housing. The city of Austin then began to close schools for African Americans elsewhere in the city and close libraries and other public facilities to force African Americans to move to the east side. Another program that the federal government pursued to enforce segregation was the work of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which subsidized the development of suburbs like Levittown, New York, on condition that they only be sold to white families and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual said that inharmonious racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. Government at all levels throughout the nation were involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive deeds in homes and places like Levittown, and judges enforced the view that these deeds did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements. Although white middle-class families that moved into suburbs like Levittown could buy property with no down payments if they were veterans and low-interest mortgages, middle-class African Americans had to make substantial down payments and get uninsured mortgages with higher interest rates. In many, if not most cases, African Americans could not get mortgages at all because the federal government would not insure them. As a result, they bought their homes on contract, like an installment plan where they accumulated no equity and could be evicted from their homes in the event of a single missed payment. Thus, contract buyers do not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date. The term redlining comes from the federal government's creation of maps of urban areas nationwide. And those maps were color-coded to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Anywhere African Americans lived, even places where African Americans lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky for the FHA to insure. The FHA's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in white neighborhoods, or even if they bought homes near those neighborhoods, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. In 1940, for example, a Detroit builder was denied FHA insurance for a project that was near an African American neighborhood. He then constructed a half-mile concrete wall, 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the two neighborhoods, and then the FHA approved the loan. In the 3 decades during which it administered this policy, however, the agency never provided or obtained evidence to support its claim that integration undermined property values. In fact, often racial integration caused property values to increase because African Americans' housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. If African Americans had access to housing throughout metropolitan areas, supply and demand balances would have kept their rents and home prices at reasonable levels. Without access, landlords and sellers were free to take advantage of the greater demand relative to supply for African American housing. A 1946 National Magazine article described a Chicago building where the landlord had divided a 540-square-foot storefront into 6 cubicles, each housing a family. He had similarly subdivided the second story. Total monthly rent was as great as that generated by a luxury apartment on Chicago's Gold Coast along Lake Michigan. Such exploitation was possible only because public policy denied African Americans opportunities to participate in the city's white housing market. As the federal government concentrated low-income African Americans in single neighborhoods, the homes became overcrowded. Families had to subdivide their homes to make their mortgage payments or their property tax payments. Cities frequently withdrew public services from African American neighborhoods. They collected garbage less frequently. They didn't provide water and sewer services. Polluting industry and toxic waste plants were placed in African American communities in order to protect white neighborhoods from deterioration. The result was that African American neighborhoods frequently turned into slums. White homeowners looked at these places and assumed that slum conditions were characteristics of African Americans, not of government policy that forced this kind of overcrowding. White homeowners then became resistant to African Americans moving into their neighborhoods because they thought they would bring slum conditions with them. Of course, the slums were not created by the people. They were created by the forced concentration, the overcrowding in these neighborhoods. Blockbusting was a scheme in which speculators bought properties in borderline black-white areas, rented or sold them to African American families at above-market prices, persuaded white families residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into African American slums and that values would soon fall precipitously, and then purchased the panicked white homes for less than their worth. Blockbusters' tactics included hiring African American women to push carriages with their babies through white neighborhoods, hiring African American men to drive cars with radios blasting through white neighborhoods, or making random telephone calls to residents of white neighborhoods and asking to speak to someone with a stereotypically African American name, like Johnny May. State licensing agencies that regulated real estate agents could have easily stopped this practice. All they had to do was to lift the license of 1 or 2 real estate agents who engaged in these practices, and the practices would have ended. While many de jure segregation policies aimed to keep African Americans far from white residential areas, public officials also shifted African American populations away from downtown business districts so that white commuters, shoppers, and business elites would not be exposed to black people. This was accomplished with slum clearance. One slum clearance tool was the construction of the federal interstate highway system. In many cases, state and local governments, with federal acquiescence, designed interstate highway routes to destroy urban African American communities. In the 1950s, there was a white middle-class neighborhood in Los Angeles that wealthy African Americans began to move into. It was called Sugar Hill. The first thing that happened was that the neighborhood association got together and tried to buy out the African American families who were moving in, offering them more money than the African Americans had paid in order to get them out of the neighborhood. When that didn't work, white homeowners tried to enforce a legal agreement prohibiting them from living in the neighborhood. And when that didn't work, the city council then decided it would be an African American neighborhood. It rezoned it for multiple family housing. It eventually became a slum. And then the Santa Monica Freeway was built to clear that slum to destroy the neighborhood. So these policies all worked together in an unconstitutional fashion to segregate Los Angeles. In 1957, Bill and Daisy Myers were able to purchase a home in Levittown, Pennsylvania, the Levitt Company's second large development. When the mail carrier discovered that he was delivering mail to an African-American family, he let everyone in the neighborhood know, and as many as 600 white demonstrators soon showed up in front of the Myers' house, pelting the family and their home with rocks. Law enforcement stood by as this happened. For 2 months, rocks were thrown, crosses were burned, the Ku Klux Klan symbol was painted on the wall next door. Some policemen stood with the mob, joking and encouraging its participants. One sergeant was actually demoted to patrolman because he objected to orders he had been given not to interfere with the rioters. In 1951, World War II veteran Harvey Clark, his wife Janetta, and 2 small children rented an apartment in all-white Cicero, a suburb of Chicago. When the Clarks refused to leave, a mob of 4,000 rioted, raiding the apartment, destroying the fixtures, and throwing the family's belongings out the window onto the lawn where they were set ablaze. Time magazine reported that the police officers present, quote, acted like ushers politely handling the overflow at a football stadium, unquote. The only people at the grand jury indicted were Harvey Clark, his real estate agent, his NAACP attorney, and the white landlady who rented the apartment to him, as well as her attorney, on charges of inciting a riot and conspiring to lower property values. Stories like this were commonplace, and state-sponsored violence was a means, along with many others, by which all levels of government maintained segregation. Today, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. Across the country in new developments, these homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working-class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000 at the minimum, 6 to 8 times national median income. The white families sent their children to college with the wealth they gained from appreciating home equity. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans who, for the most part, were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in the suburbs that had been forbidden. But it's an empty promise, because those homes are no longer affordable to the families whose parents or grandparents could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from their purchases. Consider children who come from families where they're economically stressed, or in poor health because they have no access to good health care, or because they live in polluted environments. When they do come to school, for example, they may suffer from asthma because of that pollution and are drowsy from being awake at night, wheezing. They cannot then typically achieve at levels of children who come to school well-rested. When you concentrate children like that in single classrooms, it's impossible for teachers to develop the kind of outcomes that they can in middle-class children who come to school healthy, unstressed, and able to pay attention to schooling. What economists know is that African American children from low-income families who grow up in segregated neighborhoods are less likely as adults to move into the middle class than are African American children whose families have the same low incomes but who live in integrated neighborhoods. So segregation itself impedes intergenerational mobility and perpetuates, rigidifies the inequality that we experience. Another thing that social psychologists have discovered is that decision-making is hampered when you don't have diverse decision-making groups. These psychologists have done experiments where they put people together to solve problems in both diverse groups and in segregated groups. And the diverse groups are much better able to solve problems because they challenge assumptions much more than the segregated groups do. So segregation impedes our political and economic success. We have three provisions in the federal Constitution that prohibit the kinds of actions that federal, state, and local governments pursued to create residential segregation. One is the Fifth Amendment, which requires the federal government to treat all citizens fairly. Another is the 14th Amendment that requires state and local governments not only to treat citizens fairly, but to treat them equally. And then the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, also requires that we banish the effects of slavery, which Congress long ago determined was any form of second-class citizenship. So in fact, the prohibition on African Americans to purchase homes in federally subsidized white communities or the segregation of public housing created a form of second-class citizenship which was a violation of the 13th Amendment. We cannot reverse de jure segregation mainly with lawsuits. We must also build a national political consensus leading to legislation, a challenging but not impossible task. Our focus now should be to develop policies that promote an integrated society, understanding it will be impossible to fully untangle the web of unconstitutional inequality that we've woven. To begin, we should first contemplate what we have collectively done and, on behalf of our government, accept responsibility to fix it.
Okay, so I think, am I up now? This is Matthew Fruman.
Yes.
That's always an extraordinarily difficult act to follow. What I'm gonna do is pull the camera back in terms of time, and then focus the camera in terms of geography. So going all the way back to 400 years ago, this area was populated by the Neclicheng, also known as the Anacostines. Anacostia gets its name from that tribe. And 400 years ago, the 1619 project, that's around the time where European settlers bringing African-American slaves came to the area, and they began to cultivate tobacco. And that was the big product early in the history of the area after European settlement. The result of the kind of takeover of the land was the Anacostines were driven off. There were in the 1600s a sort of refuge of them on Roosevelt Island, and now they're gone. The website that's shown at the bottom is really quite something. If you call it up and plug in an address, it will tell you which Native people lived in the area around that address, and that's how you can get this kind of information. So tobacco figured super prominently in the history and was a very slave-intensive crop. And one way that, if for the bike riders in the group, if you go on Wisconsin Avenue, which was once Rockville Pike, if you go along that road, you're on the crest of the hill. If you come from the west, you go uphill. If you come from the east, you go uphill. But Wisconsin Avenue is kind of the crest of the hill. And back in the day, the tobacco growers would roll their tobacco down that hill to the port in Georgetown, and then it would go off into the world. One of the things about tobacco is that it exhausts the soil. So you came to a time where the soil in the area was exhausted and tobacco didn't work as a product. And there's an expression that comes from that time, which we use sort of casually, sold down the river. And sold down the river is when the slaves were no longer useful in in tobacco country, they would be sold down into cotton country in the South, and families would be broken up, all of the tragedies that came from that. And you kind of see that as one of the population blips in the area in the 19th century. So in the 19th century, the area was essentially 75% white, 30% African American. That dips in the 1840s and 1850s with the African American population going down and the white population as a percentage going up. Some of that is tobacco, the exhaustion of the land. Another piece of that is that in that era, there was increasing pressure to stop the slave trade in the nation's capital. And it was an embarrassment to ambassadors from other countries and people who came from other countries. And so there was increasing pressure to get rid of the slave trade in the nation's capital. But the way in which that was done was the retrocession of Northern Virginia. So here you have Alexandria County and the city of Alexandria. They left the district, the original area of the District of Columbia in this era, in order to preserve the ability to sell slaves. And so with that departure, that's a piece, another piece of the decline in the African American population. Now, the African American population comes up significantly through the 1860s, and as a proportion comes up relative to the white population, and that's all about the Civil War. So when the Civil War came, one of the things that we did was built an enormous set of forts surrounding the whole District of Columbia to defend the nation's capital. And this one is Fort Reno, but you know them from all over the city: Fort DuPont, Fort Stevens, Fort Baird in AU Park. And here, the view from Fort Reno, you can see there's almost no trees on the horizon. And there was a reason for that. All of these trees were cut down so that the Union soldiers could see the Confederates coming if there were an attack on the Capitol. There eventually was an attack on the Capitol, and we'll talk about that in a second. But one of the other things that happens around these forts is that African Americans from the countryside came and clustered around the forts as a place of safety. Washington, the white residents of Washington, D.C. were quite hostile to African Americans, and many of them were quite hostile to the Union as well. But the Union forts were safe havens. So you saw an increase in the number of African Americans in the area as they clustered around the Civil War defenses of Washington. I'm sure many of you know the history of Fort Reno, but at the end of the war, Lee decided to do a Hail Mary and try to attack Washington, D.C. And he sent Jubal Early out from Virginia, up to Frederick, Maryland, and then down towards the city to attack the city. And the soldiers here at Fort Reno saw the dust of the arriving Confederate troops way out by Frederick, and they began shelling them from Fort Reno, slowing them enough so that they came around and attacked at Fort Stevens. And by that time, reinforcements were able to get to Fort Stevens, and they were repelled. So it turns out not to be the last time that the Capitol was attacked, but a critical one. And you may know the story that Lincoln was at the Battle of Fort Stevens and took a bullet through his hat and was pulled down by Oliver Wendell Holmes. So after the Civil War, the district, African Americans got the right to vote before African American men got the right to vote before African American men in other parts of the country. and African Americans became the key swing vote in the power of the city. And one of the things that happened, you may have heard about Boss Shepherd, who in the 1870s, after the Civil War, cut a deal that what was Washington County, Georgetown, and the city of Washington would all become one jurisdiction and all be run by the federal government. Before that, there were elected governments here, but the commissioner system essentially comes from Boss Shepherd. There were two reasons why that happened. One of the reasons that it happened was there was concern the city was a wreck, and there was concern that the country would move the capital away from Washington, D.C. to the center of the country, which would have been devastating to the business community. And another was that by giving the power to the federal government, they nullified the African American vote. And that was not a small reason for why governance over the city in the 1870s was turned over to the federal government. So I'm going to go pretty lightly over some of this era at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, because Neil Flanagan is going to speak next. And if there's ever an expert, we're really lucky to hear from Neil Flanagan, who knows this history backwards and forwards. Reno City was a place that grew up around where Fort Reno is, on Fort Reno, and was a mixed race community, 66% or so African American. It was a thriving community at the turn of the 20th century, and was one of the largest population centers in Upper Northwest. So the mix, as the film said, the mix of people living in proximity, people of different races living in proximity to each other, was quite different in the end of the 20th century than at the end of the 19th century than it is now. And the mix was better back then. This era, at the end of the 19th century, one of the things that it brought was the streetcar. So this area in Upper Northwest was pretty lightly populated. It was essentially a rural area, and the city, there was an effort to try to expand. And one of the big things, one of the vehicles to do that, and it's akin to what we see more recently, is the building of the streetcar, which takes you up what's called the escarpment. If you sit in Cardozo's stadium and look out, or when you come over 11th Street and all of a sudden the city opens up in front of you, that's the escarpment. The same thing happens over at McKinley Tech. It's built on the top of the hill. Same thing happens as you're going into Georgetown, and all of a sudden you get to that crest of the hill and you see Virginia. That's the eroded riverbed of the Potomac over millions of years. And that hill was the barrier to the development of these outlying areas. And the streetcar becomes the vehicle to get up that hill and open up areas. And also at Connecticut Avenue, there's that big canyon, and the streetcar goes over that and opens up the possibility of further density in this area of Upper Northwest. This happens at a time of relative prosperity in the African American community. There's Jim Crow, but there's also a large presence of African Americans in the civil service until that starts getting taken away, and the final nail comes in the Wilson administration. There's a thriving cultural community. There's places like Reno City where there are thriving communities. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty good time in the scheme of things. That starts to change throughout the country and here in Washington, D.C. 1919 Wilmington, the massacres, Tulsa 21. This is a Klan rally in Washington, D.C. in 1924. There were, you can see, thousands of Klan members marching, and even more thousands of residents along the side watching them march. And with this comes a number of different dynamics. One, and Neil will talk about it, the displacement of African Americans from some of the places that they've been living, exclusion of them in other places, and the big growth in Upper Northwest, including in neighborhoods like mine. And this, the thing that fascinates me about this is that all of these dynamics, you think of them as abstractions of American history. This is the deed on the house that I raised my children. And the deed makes it clear that can't be sold to persons of Negro blood or extraction, Chinese, Japanese, Armenians, Persians, or Syrians. It doesn't mention Jews, but that's just a fluke. Others in our neighborhood do. And it has this galling exception that the only reason such people can be in the premises is if they're domestic servants. So this isn't a thing that happened someplace else. This is a thing that happened right here in my backyard, literally. So now, this is here we are, 1930, 1940, and you see this huge change in the city that happens where white flight starting in the 50s in the late 40s with the striking down of the covenants that kept neighborhoods segregated, then Brown versus Board of Education. Then the riots. Many of us think the riots were the source of white flight. They're at the tail end of white flight. And the growth in the African American community. And then you see in the years since the displacement of African Americans and the return of whites to the city. Here's a way of seeing it. So that's the city overall. But if you look at, this is a set of maps that shows the density of African Americans at different times. So here's 1930s, and you see the places where African Americans live. The 1940s, you see it's changing. 1950, 1960, you see how it's changing with white flight. Here, 1970, peak of white flight. 1980, look what's happening where we live, or where I live. Nothing is happening where I live. Here you see it in 1990, here 2000, same thing, no change whatsoever. Now what you're starting to see here is places that were densely African American becoming increasingly white. And you see that happening in 2010 and 2000 and past. Be really interesting to see the 2020 data set. But the thing that doesn't change, 80 years, segregation is locked in here in 1930. 80 years later, what place in the city has not changed at all? It's Upper Northwest. So the city is on a project to try to build affordable housing, and the goal is to do it every place in the city. And this is a year old, and things are going to get better in the years to come. But this shows the total number of units produced and the total number of affordable units produced by section of the city. And as you come down, you see some, not great numbers, okay numbers, zero. This is over a 2-year period. I think it's 2018, 2019. Might be 2019, 2020. Rock Creek West is us. Rock Creek West is the western part, Upper Northwest, west of the park. No new affordable units in 2 years. And so all of it raises the question that was raised in The Color of Law. So if our history is one of separation and exclusion, and things are not changing now, what kinds of things might we do to remedy that history? And I'm going to stop now and turn it over to Neil, who can talk more about that history of separation and exclusion and how that fits in here to other things that were happening in the city. So with that, Neil, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Matthew, for that, and that excellent way of tying it together and background. Do I have screen sharing yet?
You should.
Okay, let me try again. Let's see it.
I made you co-host. You got it?
Yep. All right. So let me just. Okay. So what? Okay. All right. So yes, as Matthew said, right, I study and Emily have said, I'm studying been studying the Fort Reno community, or Reno as it was for the most part known, since about 2010. I actually grew up down the street from Fort Reno on 38th Street, and I now live in Shaw. And what I want to talk about is to sort of look at two really important things that should color our conversation here, which is the understanding of what Fort Reno was as a community, and how that gives us insights into the way this segregation, or the purpose of segregation, and the causes, and then also to look at a little bit more of the strategies that were used to achieve the racial stability that Matthew Fruman sort of showed in the last slide. And what's really interesting is actually sort of what it indicates, and what that indicates towards how to resolve it. So if you're familiar with Fort Reno, and I encourage you to read I wrote an article in the Washington City paper in 2017 that is still pretty accurate, although I've gone beyond it now. And I think it's worth a read, and not trying to understand exactly what that history is. But the short thing is that, as Matthew indicated, there was a neighborhood on the grounds of what is now Fort Reno Park in between about 1869 and say the 1940, we'll say, with the final remnants being demolished in the 1950s. What you see on screen is actually a photograph of demolition by the it says WPA, but it's actually the Progress Works Administration doing demolition on Fort Reno Hill. That's on what was called Ellicott Street. And generally, there's this sort of idea that, well, the town was this rural community, and that's what they said at the time. It was a rural community. It was out of place as the suburbs were being built out. It was in the way of progress, and it had been created more or less. It had been created more or less out of the ruins of the fort. There were supposedly contrabands, these African Americans who had settled around the fort, as Matthew said. And then it had become just sort of an anomalous slum. And this is a photograph taken by a Progress Works Administration photographer that shows one of the buildings in Reno. And people sort of, that's kind of the narrative, that there's this sort of reasonableness to it, right? That well, it was a bad neighborhood. We can take it down. If there's a racial animus, but it's more complicated than that. And that arguably was the narrative they used at the time to rebut claims about race, and it managed to essentially prevail, and the neighborhood was destroyed. And it's not, unfortunately, it more or less persisted until very recently, that this was sort of realized that this was not quite what has happened. And it's taken a lot of research to identify what has happened, but it's surprisingly easy to find. So just in case there are any people who are not from the area where we're talking about, the White House, showing this screen, just showing the White House, Capitol, Chevy Chase Circle. Cleveland Park is in between the White House, Chevy Chase Circle, obviously, and Reno, which is right there in this area that Matthew again had identified. And this area is interesting because a man named Francis Newlands, who was at the time just the heir to a major fortune, had identified essentially that there were two what he called lines of growth. One running up 16th Street. If you think of those very expensive mansions, and one running up Massachusetts Avenue, which you think of the very large mansions on there in Calorama and that kind of situation. These were ideas that these were zones that he believed were going to grow. And again, think about the map that Matthew showed. It's the same pattern. And his idea was to split the neighborhood, split the difference between the two lines and create what is now Connecticut Avenue. And that required an enormous outlay of capital. And they assembled a massive percentage of property, of a section of land, which includes everything from parts of Cleveland Park all the way out to Chevy Chase. And in the way was this community of Reno, which was sort of in between the existing road that Matthew mentioned of Wisconsin Avenue, and then also the of this Connecticut Avenue that he was building. And here we see the actual survey plat of Reno in 1869. When you imagine what he was actually looking at when he was building this, and maybe why he wasn't so worried, was at the time that the Chevy Chase Land Company, his development organization, was set up. This is what Reno looked like. The fort was still there. There were still the ruins of the fort. There was just a couple of farmhouses, and you'll see down here. Can you see my mouse? Can you see my mouse? Mm-hmm. Okay. Down here is a small little a building right here, which was a church called the Rock Creek Baptist Church. And from this time period in the late 1890s, we actually see this is where these houses date to. They're the oldest. There's some of the oldest houses, and there's some of the smallest. And they really speak to a kind of rural self-sufficiency and poverty. But that began to change because with the growth of the suburbs, not just Francis Newland's suburbs like Chevy Chase, but other ones like Friendship, and then particularly the growth of the streetcars, African American, there was a need for labor, and then a large number of speculatively built houses were built for laborers, and the African Americans who for the most part worked in these areas. And the fact that Reno was not particularly nicely laid out, the lots were small, it didn't have any of the investments that some of the better suburbs had. They were able to purchase they were able to rent at least houses like this. But even though they were just renting, they were actually able to band together and begin to create agitate for political rights. And so these records that we're going to talk about in a second have really never been seen publicly, and they sort of indicate the political organization of the residents of Reno. So even if they were relatively poor and sort of in a backwater at the time, they were fully capable of organizing to get things like this, the Reno School, which still sits behind, sorry, there's a fire truck going by, which still stands in out back of Alice Steele High School. And we can also see that in addition to agitation for things like the school, we don't have the exact letter for that, but we know that from newspaper reports that the community was very active in agitating for it. We have this letter here, which is from the Reno Citizens Association and dates to 1913, asks for some repaving. I think they also want some lights being installed. You can see the repaving they're talking about is macadamizing. And this should speak to the fact that they, like the white citizens around them, were organizing to get, before the ANCs, they were organizing these citizens associations or civic associations. That maybe we can come to that later. And they were creating these communities in order to develop their neighborhood. It was a fully politically active organization. This is common across all of DC, particularly in black neighborhoods where they don't necessarily have all the connections to get hookups in the way that, let's put it this way, Francis Newlands doesn't show up in these records very often because he was by that time a senator. He would just make calls, But what you start to see towards this period is an actual really interesting trend where the houses actually start to become a bit larger in Reno. And what they are is not just these laborers, but in fact, African Americans who began to realize that this was a desirable part of town and could not find other locations to build their houses. And we start to see these houses. I think these actually still, one of these are actually still standing. I could be wrong. I've never quite figured it out. But there are 3 houses on Nebraska Avenue that sort of look like this. And they were building, they were interested in residing in nice areas, and they were simply excluded. And here we can see this guy is a man named Samuel Hebron, who bought a very large house after sort of saving for 20 years. Was able to build a large house in his building. This was, I think it's a 6-bedroom house. It's very big. He was able to use a government salary, which even in 1922 was still somewhat feasible for African Americans there. But it was sort of on the tail end of life. That in 1913, Woodrow Wilson became president with both Southern Democratic control of both the House and Senate in tandem. And the result was they were successfully able to quietly segregate and demote federal government agencies, which heretofore had been sources of income for African Americans. And as a result, they were able to fewer opportunities. And so we can look at this, there's this very brief window when there's enough desire to live in Reno, at the same time there's still money. And Samuel Hebron really embodies this. And we can sort of also look at, again, the political organizations from this time, as they actually start to become quite organized. And here's another one from a man named Zechariah T. Thomas, and writing to a senator requesting that he be able to, thanking a congressman from Washington State that he's a senator from Washington State named Wesley Jones, requesting that thanking him for supporting education and for African Americans in the South. And what's interesting about this is Zechariah T. Thomas seems to be associated with something called the National Equal Rights League, which was actually led by an extremely elite African American named Monroe Trotter. He was a Harvard graduate, son of a big time government official during Reconstruction. And interestingly, for the time, a Democrat. And so we can see that the people who were active in Reno were oftentimes quite, if not well educated, then at least politically engaged and upwardly mobile. And you can start to see what Reno would have looked like in this is a photograph in 1927, an aerial taken probably from a biplane or something. Where you can see the kind of scope of Reno. You can see up here, up at the top, is a largely vacant development by Chevy Chase Land Company, and over to the west, which is on the left of the screen. You can see sort of the center of Tenleytown here, and then it's still pretty rural on sort of the south and eastern quarters, with the exception of a small sort of bungalow area over here. That's in, I guess they call it Wakefield. But you can start to see that there's actually a surprising diversity of housing types, different levels of newness and age in the property. You can see this is the water tanks, which were much smaller at the time, and then like this is the red brick water tower that you see on Fort Reno is this little thing right here, and then this is the Reno School over here. So Deal was placed roughly here. And the connection to this is us. I think the kind of the key to understanding what was going on right at this point was actually a project called Belmont, which is very, very unknown, which is an attempt by 4 African-American businessmen to build a African-American luxury subdivision next to Chevy Chase along Wisconsin Avenue. And they successfully got pretty far and actually made a significant number of sales. And I can post a link in the chat if you want to read a little bit more about this. But what's important is that a couple people from Belmont who were trying to buy in wealthy neighborhoods and make money, build equity through they were very open about it, build equity and have the autonomy of property ownership, and particularly property ownership in between those lines of growth, the favored quarter that Francis Newlands had identified. And they were foiled through a series of very complex legal maneuvers that ultimately, basically they ran out of money because it was a very expensive piece of property. But they came very, very close to being able to build this. And they moved, several of those people moved to Fort Reno afterwards, or including Zachariah T. Thomas. And also one of the initiators of the scheme who never ended up moving to Fort Reno, but was very active, which was James L. Neal. And James Neal would ultimately move on to be the primary defender of Reno in Congress and then also in court. So here we have, for example, if you remember this letter, that's Zachariah T. Thomas right there. Okay, so the second thing is, I don't want to take too much time, but the second thing is I want to look at how does this fit into racial segregation in DC, right? Were these neighborhoods, these elite neighborhoods within the favored quarter, were they ever, how overt were they with racism? How clear were they? And I'm curious, does anyone know what this is an ad for? What neighborhood this is an ad for? Any idea? I can't, okay, it's an ad for Capitol Heights, which is a pretty poor part of Prince George's County. And you can see the kind of things that they're advertising here, in addition to to being openly racist. And this has a very explicit racial covenant, although from a legal perspective, a pretty badly written one. And then I'll take another one like this. Do you know who this man is that deserves a full page spread in the Washington Times in the early 1900s? Is it Francis Newlands? No, it's a man named Arthur Randall. And he developed Congress Heights and Randall Heights and a whole slew of neighborhoods east of the Anacostia, with the premise that this would be a white man, sort of a white working man's working class subdivision area. And he seems to be one of the first people to reintroduce the racial covenant into DC. It had largely disappeared after the 14th Amendment because it seemed to be an obvious violation of the 14th Amendment, in particular of the 1867 Civil Rights Act, which was because DC did not have its own legislature, was still in effect in DC. Well into the nominally enforced into the 1910s, and then nominally afterwards. And I think that, looking at these guys who were very interested in I should say very interested in bringing up racial segregation and very overt about it, is very interesting. And one thing that's really interesting that's difference between this man Arthur Randall and Francis Newlands is that Arthur Randall did not have a vast estate to serve as the capital for the development of his real estate empire. He was primarily looking at investors and outside investors who were looking to turn a profit. And it's very likely that need to secure the risk was one of the reasons why racial covenants were intact. That it's in addition, whereas Francis Newlands could directly supervise the real estate empire, the operations of real estate business, Randall's investors may not have had quite the same security. And so I think it's not something that I've been able to prove, and it's unfortunately stopped because of the pandemic. I haven't been able to look into it deeper, but I believe there's some interesting nexus between the role of the financial structures that he was working in, and his expectations towards banks, and his inability and the expectation that he would explicitly exclude African Americans. Because when we look at a Chevy Chase deed, there's a whole bunch of really strict requirements that essentially this creates a very early equivalent of a homeowners association. And they have this very extreme costs of construction. I mean, a $5,000 house is a mansion, and the houses that are right off the Chevy Chase Circle, what those look like. And but there you'll see there's no racial restriction in here at all. There's no racial restriction, and there may be lots of different reasons for that. But it's sort of hard to explain what happens. And what you'll see is here's a sort of a similar map to what Matthew showed is that as soon as in 1950, as soon as racial covenants have essentially been abolished, you can see that there's the sort of racial ghettos are still fairly intact, but they melt away very quickly almost everywhere. So all these properties out here where Arthur Randall had developed, they have all fully turned over, to the point that is sort of to anyone who's not 90 years old thinks that is the primary sort of the core of the African American neighborhoods in DC. It's not historically true, but it's easy to get that impression. So with these elements, I'll just say that we need to sort of look at things like racial explicit techniques like that, and we can sort of say maybe racial covenants worked, but something else is happening. Something else. There are structures, as the video, which the fantastic video we watched earlier indicate. There are other structures that are operating, and they intersect in particular with as the video sort of reached at the end, with the structural racism of unequal wealth and unequal access to finance. And those we can start to see this constellation of discriminatory tools, which Francis Newlands used, and which are still very much bound up in the idea of residential neighborhoods in the United States. And it's worth pointing out that a lot of these techniques are completely unique to the United States. In particular, things like single dwelling detached zoning is a unique phenomenon to the United States. Certain aspects of the government underwriting of 30-year mortgages are completely unique to the United States. And a lot of these are ideas that are brought out by men who worked for Arthur Randall and evolved his ideas. And are very tied up in this sort of financial system, and also this sort of catering to racial prejudice and finding ways to cater towards anxieties about stability that homeowners might have. And then in particular, treating housing as an asset, and not just in terms of, oh, it's an apartment building or whatever, but literally that the house, making people invested in the increasing value of the house in order to ensure that property remains valuable, both for the developer and also for them. So when we look across this great country, this is Levittown, I think we need to look very deeply at not just to look for obvious signs of discrimination, obvious ways of exclusion, but in particular, as the video showed, that the system is very deep and it's very entrenched, and it's moved on from the point where, at a formative point in American history, there was very open discrimination, and that has left intersections between that discrimination and the inability of things to take care of the market of politics, of neighborhood control, to actually to undo that damage. And I think that's kind of where I want to leave it, that there are historical conditions that have created a condition now that we see in that map, and understanding those and the ways in which there was an alternate history where we would not have had that, where we could have had a more equal society, that was deliberately avoided in the early 20th century. And I think that's a really exciting topic. And I think that Ward 3 is in many ways still conditioned by that transformation that happened in the early 20th century. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Neil and Matthew. We really appreciate that. And just want to note that we, all the panelists met beforehand, and we intentionally agreed the primary focus and point of this program was to delve into the history and how we got here, because it wasn't by accident that Upper Northwest has remained mostly white for all this time, but we didn't want to just leave it at that. We did want to address what can we do? What are some organizations and groups doing? So with that, Margaret, Margaret Dwyer is the executive director of Ward 3 Housing Justice. Do you want to go next?
Thanks, Emily. You give me too much credit. We're all volunteers. So I'm not really an executive director of anything, except maybe my house. So I really appreciate all the historical background because it really makes my job so much easier. It makes clear 3 present moment realities. First, as we've seen, deliberate displacement and exclusion demand repair. And second, that repair is everyone's ethical and practical responsibility. And third, most important to us as a housing justice working group, we believe that the timid, incremental tools and policies that have been used so far to address this housing and inequality crisis will never get us to housing justice. Including a few units of so-called affordable housing in a big project just doesn't cut it. And that doesn't even beg the question of who those units are truly affordable for. Every time I think of this, I think of one of my sheroes, Audre Lorde, who reminded us decades ago that we're never going to dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. So at Ward 3 Housing Justice, we're a grassroots working group that advocates truly affordable housing and economic opportunity in Ward 3. We celebrate the recent census results that show Ward 3 as one of only 2 wards in the entire district where the Black population increased over the past 10 years. And we believe that Ward 3 should be available to all who would choose to live here. Folks on fixed incomes, folks who work here in our stores, hotels, restaurants, medical facilities, senior homes, and the like, families, grand families, so many others, and we're ready to welcome them all to our neighborhoods. We started when a dozen or so of us connected at one of Empower DC's grassroots planning coalitions meetings only last winter, and we've grown steadily since then. And I think really one of the reasons is that our message of urgency around fairness and justice has resonated in the hearts of a lot of our neighbors. And we've accomplished a lot in only a few months. As an affiliate of the DC Grassroots Planning Coalition, we lobbied successfully for many important changes in the comp plan, and we won them. And now we're not stopping there. We're pushing forward with those changes and interacting with the Office of Planning around the types of planning activities that are happening in Rock Creek West and efforts to define the racial equity lens, which is required in the comp plan, but the exact mechanics of it is not defined. And Rock Creek West is unique in its history and does deserve a very specific kind of racial equity lens. We've also partnered with activists across the city to produce a bold reimagining of affordable housing with our proposal of the conversion of the Wardman Hotel. And although it went up in private auction, we are not giving up there either. And we continue to press for Wardman 2.0 with the new owners. And although it makes my head hurt, we are deep in the weeds on housing policy and financing tools, pushing for models that really are going to create the kinds of housing we need and the amounts of housing we need. And that is 1,990 units, including deeply affordable and family units, along with home owning opportunities and wealth building opportunities. We're also working to identify sites in areas like Friendship Heights, which is my neighborhood, that we think are ripe for reimagining. If this work were easy, it would already be done. But moneyed interests and fear-based stereotypes, things like concentration of poverty and these tropes about affordable housing have prevailed for a really long time. So, you know, Frederick Douglass, for whom our new state will be named, reminds us that power concedes nothing without struggle. And we invite you to join our struggle. You can sign up at our website. I'll put the website in the chat, and be part of the change we need in a whole continuum of action. You can sign up, as hundreds have, just to to write an occasional email, to come to an occasional demonstration, to take an occasional small action. Or you can join our actual working group. We need you. We want you. And you can also, down the line, affiliate with the CDC that has been formed now in Rock Creek West, Northwest Opportunity Partners CDC, of which we are an affiliate, and which is aiming to be the go-to strategic partner for public-private partnerships in development and redevelopment, as well as the creation of economic opportunities in Rock Creek West. So join us. Thank you so much.
Emily, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Margaret. I put the link for Ward 3 Housing Justice in the chat, and we will have Q&A just once we hear from Barbara, who again is the co-chair of WIN's Ward 3 Congregation's Affordable Housing Work Group.
Thank you, Emily. Can you hear me okay? Good evening, everybody. I am co-chair, as Emily said, with Jamie Butler of Adas Israel Congregation of the WIN Ward 3 Congregation's Affordable Housing Work Group. Jamie and I'm a member of Temple Sinai, and Ann Michael from National United Methodist Church brought our congregations together in 2019 to figure out a way to act around affordable housing in our own neighborhoods here in Ward 3. All three of our congregations were and are members of the Washington Interfaith Network, WIN. Congregants from all three of our institutions and others in Ward 3 have for years advocated and organized with WIN and its allies for affordable housing elsewhere in DC. WIN is a multiracial, multi-faith, multi-ethnic organization of faith institutions and social justice nonprofits. We in WIN organize ourselves, our fellow congregants, our neighbors and friends in numbers so that we can exercise our collective power as citizens. I'll share a little more about WIN in a moment, but first I want to share with you a little bit of what our WIN Ward 3 congregation's work group is doing. I mentioned that many of us in Ward 3 had supported WIN allies and WIN campaigns in other parts of the city. But a few things focused Jamie and me and Ann here in Northwest DC. Among them were the controversies surrounding the proposed comp plan changes that Margaret mentioned that were going to increase density in our neighborhoods. Also hearing about displacement of Black residents in other parts of the city, learning of the mayor's ambitious plan for 1,900 units of affordable housing in Upper Northwest, we were mobilized and galvanized. Starting in 2019, members and clergy from our three congregations have been meeting and organizing and educating ourselves to support affordable housing in Ward 3. We're looking at land in DC, land owned by DC and the federal government as places to build affordable housing. We're looking at possible sites in Chevy Chase, Tenley, Friendship Heights, and elsewhere, and at aggressive demands for affordable units where private owners and developers are involved. We're continuing to educate ourselves and our congregations through our monthly Zoom discussions with guests who have time and expertise to share, former zoning officials, community leaders, for-profit and nonprofit developers, and financing experts. We're engaging with our ANC commissioners to let them know that affordable housing is our priority. We've committed to and we've begun deep engagement with neighbors in our Upper Northwest neighborhoods, including doing a lot of door knocking. We've begun deep engagement with people who work in institutions and businesses in Ward 3 who might want to live here and avoid the horrendous commutes. For example, teachers, school staff, retail workers, restaurant workers, employees of UDC and Howard Law School. We're supporting the Wilson Students Rally for Affordable Housing this coming Saturday at Fort Reno, and Emily's going to put the flyer for that in the chat. And lastly, we're planning an action here in December to which we will invite all of you to build on our listening sessions and our ideas. I'll conclude by telling you a little bit more about WIN. WIN builds power through listening and through relationships. It's time-consuming and it's incredibly rewarding. And we in WIN think that relationships and listening are essential if we are to act on the values that our faith traditions and our moral compasses require of us. In WIN, we've organized ourselves in our congregations to door knock in Hill East and Reservation 13 to listen to residents and listen to churches and institutions in the neighborhood. WIN clergy and lay leaders went on to establish deep relationships with those in the city who can make change happen. We had input into the RFPs for Reservation 13 and into the city's evaluation of developers' proposals. Most recently, we saw the groundbreaking for 100 new units of permanent supportive housing for seniors there at Reservation 13. WIN Ward 6 congregations and others were key actors in that result. Our active role in Reservation 13 development is ongoing. In WIN, our relationships with the Housing Authority, with Council, with the Deputy Mayor, with the Office of Planning are not personal friendships. They are built on mutual trust and mutual respect and mutual self-interest, and they are the product of months and in some cases years of effort and engagement. In WIN, we've organized ourselves to support public housing residents as they face the demolition or redevelopment of their homes. We have deep relationships with the resident associations at Langston Terrace, Judiciary House, Potomac Gardens, and Benning Terrace in Ward 7. We're working with them and the Housing Authority and with green builders to ensure that redeveloped homes are comfortable and energy efficient. And we're working as well to address ongoing lead and rodent infestation. We're working to identify homes around Benning Terrace to make them available to lower and middle income families. In WIN, our Black Equity Through Home Ownership campaign is steered by finance and other experts right out of our own congregations. They're putting together a strategic plan with concrete steps to build Black wealth. WIN citywide is looking at public lands in addition to Reservation 13 and our public housing work, both federal and DC owned, as I mentioned. We're looking at RFK Stadium, among other sites. In WIN, we support each other across the city. Speaking of Benning Terrace, I want to share with you some of the passion from the WIN clergy meeting the other day, last Thursday, on a sunny lawn right across from Benning Terrace at First Rock Baptist Church. Rabbi Aaron Alexander of Adas Israel spoke to the assembled clergy, the lay leaders, and the WIN organizers about the work that we WIN Ward 3 congregations are doing. He recommitted us to the work of making homes for people, homes here in Ward 3. And as he spoke, the Benning Terrace Resident Association leaders who were there applauded. Black leaders from congregations at Berry Farm, Rosedale, River Terrace, and other neighborhoods told us they were excited by what we're doing here in Ward 3, that they support us, that they will stand with us, and they also want us to stand with them. So in WIN, it's all about listening and relationships and building power together, collectively. Thank you again, Reverend Jennings and Emily and Cleveland Park Congregational for giving me the opportunity to participate in this discussion.
Thank you all. And now, as I promised, the Q&A section. You can use the chat feature, but we would encourage you to speak using the hand raise feature. If you are not familiar, it's with the the reactions on the bottom of your screen. You can select raise hand. But if you can't find that, just feel free to go like this, and I'm sure one of us will find you. Well, someone just asked where reservation 13 is. Barbara, do you want to answer that?
Yes, if you go out East Capitol Street and Independence Avenue, and you just keep going to the Stadium Armory Metro stop, and you look around, and there's this vast space that is beginning to be developed. And I know that Wynn has been working around there for at least 10 years, organizing and building relationships with the residents and the institutions around there. Actually, it was the Relisha Rudd. There are a number of Wynn congregations over there, but it was the Relisha Rudd incident that really got us in, a lot of us in deep over in that project. And actually that incident, of course, led to the building of the family emergency housing in each of the wards after DC General was shut down.
Someone had asked earlier, does anyone know whether people have connected with members from the congregations that were at Fort Reno?
I can answer that question. I don't know whether anyone at Wynn has. They do exist. One is it's called St. George's and is in an Episcopalian church in Bloomingdale. And then the Rock Creek Baptist Church, which I mentioned in my presentation, has been reconstituted, but was actually gentrified out of two neighborhoods after Fort Reno, first Foggy Bottom and then Petworth, and is now in Prince George's County. It has a new name, but I can't remember off the top of my head, but I can put in the chat.
Anyone else? I'm going through all the grid to make sure I'm not missing anything.
Emily, this is Ellen and Pastor Ellen, and I'm just, I know that, a number of folks who are attending this evening are very interested in, sort of the next steps aspect of things. And, my understanding from Margaret and Barbara is that, the best way we can take next steps is to get involved with one of the organizations that on the ground is doing the work right now. We already have, Ward 3 Housing Justice, which is focusing very specifically on affordable housing and just housing in this particular ward. And then Wynn, of course, is taking a broader view on affordable housing and racial justice in, DC, generally speaking. And so, just strongly encouraging folks to connect with those two organizations, since we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We've got people on the ground doing the work already.
Okay. Okay, I see a question from Lori Winter. Do you want to unmute?
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to ask, there was I live in Ward 5, very close to Ward 4, and Ward 4 is the other ward that's sort of targeted for some of this community-led planning for affordable, deeply affordable housing. And Margaret, you mentioned something about different financial instruments and different financial models that you were looking into. Is that something that as Ward 4 moves along in their planning that we might discuss with you, find out more about?
That would be great. We actually have been interfacing with a group working on a project on Georgia Avenue, I think.
Okay.
So yeah, please reach out to us through the website or. Okay.
Yeah. No, I'm here representing Plymouth Congregational Church and also the Potomac, what is that called? Association for the Justice and Witness, and the DC group that works on housing justice. There are a few more of us here as well. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
Emily, someone just asked about Ward 3 Vision, and I just Googled them, and I'm happy to put the link in the chat group. But if anyone can speak with more information about that group, please feel free.
You know, I can speak to it a little, and I think that one of the really exciting things is, you know, let 1,000 flowers bloom. That there's, you know, the two groups that are represented here that are really interested in trying to promote affordable housing, and then Ward 3 Vision comes from a different perspective. Ward 3 Vision has sort of an urbanist perspective about developing along the transit corridors and strengthening the business corridors and and including the opportunity for affordable housing as a part of that. And so they end up being an ally on pushing for increased affordable housing. And it was interesting in the comp plan process that you had a little bit of strange bedfellows, because you had some people in the affordable housing community who were supportive of the comprehensive plan, as the developers were supportive of the comprehensive plan as a way of getting there. And then you had people who were against the comprehensive plan because they thought that it had an impact of would have an impact of displacement in lots of places. And that argument is a really tough argument in lots of places. It turns out it's not an argument in Upper Northwestern Ward 3, because in Upper Northwestern Ward 3, we did our displacement 80 years ago. And so now it's not that we're going to do more displacement. It's a question of what kinds of steps we're going to take to remedy it. And Margaret's list of things was really compelling. I think one of the big things is setting a compass point of a lot of people, including the congregations, importantly the congregations, and that's where WIN can play an important role, expressing the importance of achieving more affordable housing in this area. And then you get into a situation where it's kind of project by project. It's kind of, small area plan by small area plan, and putting your shoulder down and trying to get the most out of those opportunities as you possibly can. The group's focused on the Wardman. Things are going to come up around Friendship Heights in the small area plan, Tenleytown. It's happening in Chevy Chase. There's lots of places to dial in. A big thing is making it emphatically clear this is a thing that we want to do. We want to bend the history of this area, and then figuring out for you how to plug in on the neighborhood by neighborhood projects that can make that happen.
Emily, I have another question in the chat. If we were to ensure families similar to Relisha Rudd being able to stay and thrive in DC, we need to push housing with more than 2 bedrooms and free housing to ensure extremely low-income families have access to housing. So is anybody able to speak to the topic of deeply affordable housing? I know, just for general information, and I'll put this in the chat room, that Jubilee Housing in the Adams Morgan neighborhood focuses very specifically on deeply affordable housing issues.
I can just comment that I've taken the Jubilee Housing Walk, and I highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in actually, getting their boots on the ground, so to speak. I don't know how often they do it, at least once a year, where they just invite a group of people to come over and walk around the neighborhood and see what they've built, and it's really, really quite impressive. I can speak very generally from WIN's experience, and it is that our success has been, and the success of WIN affiliates has been in mixed income housing that includes deeply affordable housing. That's where we have done the best and gotten the most support.
there's a question, well, there's a few questions from the chat, but let's start with no, I just lost it. For any of the speakers, Matthew Fruman showed that depressing chart that showed that Rock Creek West is the only area that has built no new affordable housing in the last 2 years. What is or are the main obstacles holding this back?
Well, as a former ANC commissioners, I think there's a bunch of ANC commissioners on this call, which is wonderful. And neighborhood opposition to any kind of development can be fierce. You saw it in Cleveland Park over the temporary housing facility that was built on Idaho Avenue, and land value. So neighborhood opposition creates one barrier. Land value creates another barrier. You need to be a mission-driven organization or have access to public-owned land or have the government purchase the land in order to make it affordable, in order to be able to pull it off in this part of the city. And so I chair the board for the Listener Home. We're a mission-driven organization. We're going to build 80 to 100 units of deeply affordable senior housing. But we're a mission-driven organization, and we know that we're leaving a ton of money on the table. That's harder for other private landowners to do, where land values are so high. So it's a confluence of fear of the neighborhood and price of the neighborhood.
So we have two additional, one comment and one question. One participant says that the panel needs to update their presentation materials to reflect what Margaret touched on briefly, that Ward 3 had the sharpest rise in people of color moving into this ward of any of the wards from 2010 to 2020 census. Do any of you want to comment on that before I ask the question?
It's great.
Yeah,
I need to update mine. I developed mine before the 2020 census came out, and that's absolutely great news. From looking around that it's increased some, but and I hope it's dramatic, but to get back to where it was 80 years ago, still got a long way to go.
Margaret, you were going to add to that?
Yeah, I think that what that statistic does is really give lie to the argument that we hear that sort of goes around the social media echo chamber that, Ward 3 is racist, Ward 3 doesn't want affordable housing, Ward 3 is going to fight any kind of affordable housing. That hasn't been our experience. We see the Black population increasing dramatically, and our efforts on the Wardman conversion, although we didn't ultimately prevail, we talked to so many neighbors in the area who were enthusiastic about it, who wanted the sensitivity of local development to trump outside interests, to say, save the green space and provide classrooms for Oyster School, provide a range of incomes 0 to 80 so that folks can move up without having to move out, to build in a limited equity co-op into the plan so that folks could move in to home ownership. And we didn't hear a lot of pushback about any of that. We had hundreds of people sign the petition and agree to that. So we think that actually the tide is so turning in this ward, and the time is right this moment to seize for truly affordable housing in the ward.
Thank you, Margaret. The other question, I believe the primary challenges of affordable housing production are: one, the huge subsidy needed of construction cost per unit; two, the availability of public land where affordable housing can be built via subsidized land value on top of construction subsidy. This is actually in the chat, so if you're not following my verbal, you can look at it. And three, NIMBYism. What are the advocacy groups represented here doing to meet these challenges in Ward 3? Thank you for the hard work and any answers.
Well, I'll speak for the Wardman group. One of the things that they tried to do is to convert private land into public land, which would open the path to building, to overcoming one of those hurdles. I think folks at Wynn are looking at similar kinds of strategies in other places. NIMBYism, a lot of this conversation is trying to change the discussion about NIMBYism. You know, what happened in our backyard is bad already, and doing things to change it is the right thing to do. I served on an ANC 10 years ago, and the discussion in the district was in Upper Northwest was completely different 10 years ago than it is today. Groups like Ward 3 Vision are really important in changing that, but now Wynn and the advocacy that the folks who've been focusing on the Wardman have done is also a really big part of it. So the conversation is bending. Doesn't mean that it immediately turns into a whole lot of of change, but the gears are turning in a way that's different than 5-10 years ago.
Anyone else?
Sure. So I think that it's a great question in terms of the challenges. I think that fundamentally the regulatory structure that governs development in DC is not amenable, and particularly it's not amenable in Ward 3 to actually developing substantial amounts of affordable housing, particularly deeply affordable housing. You know, the reality is most land in Ward 3 is luxury housing. It is single family homes that are unaffordable. You know, we actually have lots of 3 and 4 bedroom units in DC. They're very expensive units, and I'm gonna bite the hand that feeds me by saying this. But you know, what is the affordability of those? No one ever asks those. No one ever asks about that. It's the assumption that we're going to build affordable housing sort of next down the street, and maybe accept that, and that would be great. But you know, we need to look at strategies that can open up land that is not just vacant land, because the city is not going to stop growing, and you know, we need to be able to look at strategies that not just increase density, maybe as Ward 3 Vision wants, but in particular recapture that for affordability. And one strategy that I think needs to be looked at is called an affordable housing overlay. And 2 strategies have been made to work with this. In particular, one that look at is Cambridge, Massachusetts, the town not next to Boston. And you know, what they did is they basically permitted a significantly higher zoning permissions in areas that would otherwise be lower density, including single dwelling detached houses, in exchange if they were some form of affordable housing, and it could be extended to something like a community land trust. And that ability to open up that land would in particular make the value of the land differential for organizations. Like, as I said, land cost and challenges of approvals are 2 big issues. If a for-profit entity could not buy a property at a high density, but an affordable developer could, that would fundamentally change their ability to acquire that land, because it might be more expensive. They might be able to pay more than a single family homeowner would, purchaser, but that would still be less than what a for-profit developer could pay if it was specifically assigned higher densities for affordable housing.
Thank you, Neil. I want to highlight that one of our participants is emphasizing that, you know, we really don't have deeply affordable housing in DC, and certainly not in Ward 3. And it's an incredibly large and important problem, and just needs to be highlighted in all of our discussions. Another question: does anyone know how much, if any, affordable housing is in the Fannie Mae redevelopment?
Yes, that's one of the cases that has made us feel so strongly about the ineffectiveness of current practices to create affordable housing. It's typical inclusionary zoning, a little sort of trickle down set aside of affordable housing, so that what happens is between Fannie Mae and the adjoining redevelopment, there are probably just shy of 1,400 units being built. And that means there'll be about 140 affordable units. And they are not deeply affordable units, and they are not family-sized units. And that's why at Ward 3 Housing Justice, we are so adamant in our belief that IZ, or the typical programs that are in use now, are never going to get us where we need to go. The inequality is baked in to those kinds of tools. And that's why we need to go right to the root of it and address the tools themselves and the policies themselves, because it's not a lack of money. It isn't a lack of money. We could have the subsidy. We could buy the land. It's not, it's a lack of will. And political will. That's really what it is.
Well, Margaret, that goes directly into the next question. What do the panelists have to say about the IG report issued this week that talks about all of the affordable housing monies that Muriel has squandered by funneling those monies through her developer buddies and have not added the units that could have been added?
Exactly. And we have called for oversight hearings. We've asked Anita Bonds to, as the chair of the housing committee, to call for oversight hearings, because this is not the first, and it may not even be the worst of the waste and misuse that has gone on, literally causing and exacerbating the housing inequality problem instead of solving it. So yeah, there should be huge outcry. Please join us in this. Contact Anita Bonds. This can't go on as it is now.
Yeah, I agree with what Margaret and Neil have suggested, that the regulatory structure we're dealing with has to be changed. And the only way that's going to happen is for us to bring pressure in large numbers, to organize ourselves and bring pressure on these officials. That's the only way there's going to be any kind of accountability or transparency.
Okay. Next question. Is there any conversation about liberalizing single family zoning to allow for less expensive homes in areas that were segregated? For example, Portland, Oregon has passed an ambitious zoning reform to get more accessibly priced housing as well as affordable housing in areas that previously allowed only single family homes. They allow up to 6,000 square feet fourplexes to sixplexes as long as half of the units are affordable, meaning 60% MFI.
Matthew, do you want to comment on that single family zoning issue?
Well, the idea has been bandied about at different times of changing single family zoning. It is an explosive issue. The mayor did a round of consultations before she came out with her housing program, and they explored different ideas of what you could do in Upper Northwest to develop to develop affordable housing. And one of the ideas that was knocked around was the idea of changes to single family zoning, but that idea didn't make it into the final set of recommendations because the political freight of it would be so high. And then on the Chevy Chase, there was a round of saying, well, let's look at this. And the Office of Planning did a report about things that might be done and exploring that idea. And the idea of changes to single family zoning in a limited area in Chevy Chase became associated with the small area plan and the comp plan changes and elicited enormous opposition. And so I think the idea is out there, it's happening in some places, but I think that it's been viewed and as politically a lightning rod at this point. The one thing that's like that actually has been happening is trying to make it easier to do accessory dwelling units. And you see these kinds of buildings going up in alleys where you have housing that gets added on a lot as an accessory dwelling unit. And everything that's old is new again. You know, we had alley dwellings at a time, and now we're starting to see it again. Sometimes if you walk through an alley, you'll see what looks like a full-size house in the alley. So to the extent that there's any breakdown in single-family zoning in Upper Northwest, it's more about the ADUs than sweeping zoning changes at this point.
Can I just note that I think that's great, Matt, but the state of California abolished single family zoning last month.
Thank you, Neil. Emily, we have, there are a number of comments, and I encourage everyone to read them. But we have one more question, and that is, even though displacement in Ward 3 took place earlier, we still have seniors and others on fixed income in Ward 3 who are being pushed out. In addition, the city's plans for quote unquote affordable housing aren't really affordable to those who most need housing affordability. The OIG's report on the Housing Production Trust Fund shows that the city isn't really behind that. Could you please speak, and specifically Margaret, could you please speak about the definition of affordable housing?
Well, I think that that affordable housing, absent any government policy, is when people pay about 30% of their income for their housing, which would be something that could be accomplished in developments that use a social housing model, which is something that we endorse, where no matter what you make, when you move into the social housing model, you pay 30% of it. So if you live on a disability policy, then you pay 30% of that. And if you make, if you're an entrepreneur and you make much more money, you pay 30% of that, and it evens out. And it's actually a model that works a lot in Europe. When the government is talking about affordable housing, they put it into tiers of like deeply affordable housing, 0 to 30, in some cases 0 to 40. Low income housing is up to 50 or 60, and low to moderate income housing is up to 80% of the AMI, the average family median income. So for example, that would mean 0 to 80, which is a very common model, would mean no income, up to 80% of the AMI, which for a family of 4 is $103,000 a year. So to qualify for certain kinds of loans and tax abatements and things, you have to meet those guidelines. The financing mechanisms are tied to those benchmarks. Also, while I have the floor here, I'd like to go back to something that was said earlier about the hearings and about holding our electeds accountable for managing our money and doing the ethical, legal things that they are supposed to be doing with it. And I actually would like to place a call right now to all of the panelists, the 4 panelists, and to anybody else here in this room tonight, this virtual room, to join in a call to Anita Bonds to draft a letter or some kind of a document that we would all agree to sign to call for hearings on this egregious abuse of funding that should have gone to house our neighbors who need it the most. I'd like to put that call out to the group, a call to action.
Thank you, Margaret. Do you have a suggestion for how to initiate that?
Oh, no, now wait a minute. Now we have to do it. Wait. So Emily, do you have all the participants of this session, like a way to contact everybody?
Yes, we should have that from the Zoom.
So suppose you pulled the 4 of us together before. You were great at it. It was a fabulous, well-organized meeting. Would you call the 4 of us together again, and we'll come up with a document that we'll circulate and get everybody to sign? And let's say by the close of business Friday, we have got something on Anita Bond's desk that she can't ignore.
Beautiful. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you.
Definitely want takeaways from this evening. There's actually one more question, then I would like to just make a comment, and Emily will close us out. The final question is, in Friendship Heights, Mazza Galleria, and the Embassy Suites building, etc., obviously they're nearly empty. What is happening there? It was mentioned earlier, and so just wondering what is happening there.
So Mazza Gallery is going to be probably a matter of right development. It is going to be redeveloped with 350 units. And it'll probably be the same thing as City Ridge. There'll be a handful of kind of trickle down units. The other building, Friendship Place, is more interesting because there has to be a PUD process on what they want to do. And so we may be able to negotiate more effectively there. And I think that actually that's something that maybe the newly formed CDC, the Northwest Opportunity Partners Community Development Corporation, could start to work on, although maybe a lot of us could start to work on that. I was going to just go up there next week and see if I could talk to anybody. Anybody want to come? Let me know. Oh, one other thing. There was a study, right? The Office of Planning commissioned the study group, the think tank ULI, what is that? Urban Land Institute or something like that. And they did a study of Friendship Heights and the redevelopment there. And they've noted that WMATA would like to move into the Lord and Taylor site because it would be so much better for the bus garage. And we'd like to propose a social housing development or a limited equity co-op or a mix of arrangements for the site at the WMATA bus garage. We think it would be a lot cheaper to buy than the Wardman. And we think we could create a beautiful community there. And we know that, like Matt, for example, is creating this great community for seniors, expanding the great community for seniors at the Lisner. And they provide 5-star care there. And we want the people who work there to be able to live at the WMATA bus garage redeveloped site for affordable housing, and everybody else who would choose to live there. So
100%.
There could be a lot of possibilities.
100% for that, that's for sure. But part of what's happening is in Friendship Heights is that there's money in the budget to do a small area plan or planning process for Friendship Heights, and that becomes the vehicle to advocate for the kind of thing that Margaret is talking about, because part of that small area plan problem could be WMATA moving, and then what happens in the wake of that, and that's a forum to be advocating in the kind of way that's being talked about. And that's happening in Chevy Chase for projects there, and it should happen in Tenleytown as well. But that's a big opportunity. Friendship Heights has the possibility of absorbing an enormous number of units and an enormous number of affordable units and really changing the dynamic. And so everybody here should be at the table in some way on that Friendship Heights small area plan.
Great. Thank you, both of you. Emily is going to raise a question about 2 bedrooms, and then we are going to close out with Emily and me each saying something, and we will stop by 9 o'clock, which ironically was actually the time that we originally had conceived that this would end. And then we were like, no, we should end it by 8:30. So, we all learn. Everything's a learning curve. We've certainly realized that over the past year and a half. Go ahead, Emily.
Deshaun says that there are a number of 2-bedroom and plus units under construction in Wisconsin Avenue and Van Ness, so that saying there's 0 units of affordable housing is misleading. Any of you want to comment?
Yeah, I think when I said about the numbers for Rock Creek West, I said that these are from a couple of years ago and that things are happening. Absolutely.
If they're not on the market yet, then they're
yeah, well, they weren't part of the report at that time, but I acknowledged there are things happening. Some of it is like City Ridge, which has IZ units. But there's other things that are happening. There's and we will see more affordable units coming on stream. But for a 2-year period, that number is accurate for a 2-year period. And now we're getting we'll see how much better traction we get and how much it delivers in terms of getting to the kinds of numbers of affordable units we'd all like to see. The goal of 1,900, I believe, for Rock Creek West, there's a long way to go to get to that, including with the things that are in the pipeline.
Thank you, Matthew. So before Emily closes us out, I want to thank you all so much for coming. And I also want to say that it did not escape our notice that all of our speakers this evening were white. Our congregation has typically, and certainly in the past when we've done our summer social documentary series presentations, some of you have attended those, we have always made a great effort to have a diversity of speakers. I think that frankly, the fact that we are very Ward 3 focused this evening has something to do with the fact that all of our speakers are white. It's certainly true for what our congregation looks like in Cleveland Park. But I will say that it is an intention and a commitment of ours to include more diverse voices, to prioritize listening to Black and Brown voices. And our congregation has just initiated a racial justice audit of ourselves, and certainly encourage all of us to do that sort of work. So thank you. And Emily, please close us out.
I just want to thank all of you for participating and, sticking through a long program till 9 p.m. I'm usually like putting my daughter to bed and heading to bed myself, so I appreciate it. And I want to thank all of the panelists, Matthew, Neil, Margaret, Barbara, thank you so much for your involvement in this. And I think this was really great, and I'm really excited that it seems like a lot of energy, and I hope that this is just the first step towards concrete action. So good night, everyone. And yes, we will follow up with you. And and just up to Saturday.
Wilson High School.
9 o'clock at the corner of Chesapeake and Nebraska.
Yes, I'm putting it again in the chat. Okay. Thanks again, and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care.